Well, good morning, good evening, or good afternoon, depending upon you're watching this webinar. My name is Dave Nagel with Corwin Press, and I'm really excited to meet a lot of you next week. I've met many of you last June when I began some common formative assessment work with some of your teachers and leaders, but I'm going to be meeting all of you next Tuesday for a day in Visalia to focus on how do we lead as instructional leaders, as building administrators, coordinators, how do we lead quality formative assessment in all of our classrooms? So I'm going to just jump right in, and a little bit about me and my background, why I'm going to be kind of sharing some things with you. I've been working with common formative assessments now for over 16 years. Actually, I just checked it. It was actually 1999, so I realized I was off. It was actually 18 years. I started working with Larry Ainsworth as a classroom teacher who came to my former district. And some of you are familiar with Larry Ainsworth's Power Standards and Unwrapping the Standards and a few other of his pieces. He came to my district. And so I began to implement as a classroom teacher. And then I connected with Larry and became sort of the district liaison for all of his work. Became an administrator in a very large high school, about 4,400 students in my former district. And then have been consulting and presenting Larry's work along with visible learning and other pieces, data teams, PLCs, those things throughout the last about 12 years full time. And I'm just kind of impressing upon everybody that my role and background with you is as a former administrator, but also someone who has taught, presented, and led quality formative assessment work to help guide our work as leaders, as we're leading it with our teachers who are implementing some quality formative assessment work, but also even if they haven't engaged yet in any of the common formative assessment work, specifically from Larry Ainsworth's framework, how we guide that. One thing I want to say, anytime I have a webinar, I want to have a commitment to interaction. And obviously we're not live, so you can't text me in the moment, but I wanted to put up my email, my cell phone number, and then my Twitter account. I've had amazing conversations with Phil and some of the other leaders in Visalia, and I just want to press upon everybody. I've had about 7 conversations this fall alone, conversations that I've had since mid-August, planning for these days. And that doesn't just happen. And conversations around making sure, is this going to be geared specifically to where we are with our current work in Visalia? How is this going to be something that is classroom teachers, or for our group, building instructional leaders that we can use the very next day? If there's one thing that all of us are in our profession, is time poor. None of us ever have enough time. So I want to impress upon you, I want to do my very best to listen to what your thoughts are. And so if you're watching this webinar the night before we come together, or tomorrow, which would be Tuesday, shoot me an email, shoot me a question if you have a thought. You have my cell phone number. Do not hesitate to reach out and talk. And certainly some of you might wait until we meet in person. But I just want to impress upon you my desire to meet your needs where you're at and kind of guide through some of our work that I want to share with you, but make sure that it fits around Visalia, not the other way around, not Visalia having to fit around what I'm going to share. One of the things I want to mention as we kind of go through all of our work, and I've done this with your teachers, and I do it with anyone I'm working with, but when you think about any assessment, any quality assessment really comes down to these 3 points. What's my purpose? When do I have enough evidence to make an inference? And so at the classroom level, as a classroom teacher, I'm thinking I've got a purpose to make sure students understand CVC words, how to add, subtract, and multiply, main idea, reading comprehension, etc. So building administrator, I've got a purpose when I come into a classroom to make sure that there's certain things in place in terms of our walkthrough look-fors. And then also, more importantly, after we kind of gauge for the things that we should just expect each and every time, standards posted, things of that nature, I'm trying to make an inference from evidence where that teacher is instructionally, where they are in terms of their classroom management. I'm going to gather evidence to make an inference. We do this when we're driving to work, that we want to get to work on time and make sure we have our Starbucks in our hand. And we might drive through the Starbucks and see that there's too many people in line to be able to meet our purpose. We make an inference from that evidence. So when we narrow it down to these 3 points, we can really probably gather better evidence. But it goes back to that first point. What was my purpose? So with the teachers, we're always focusing on the power priority standards. The administrators, what are your priority power look-fors when you're in a classroom, or when you're in a classroom observation? You're kind of guiding teachers and trying to help them when they are sharing their assessment information, how it impacts their instruction, their day-to-day instructional curricular decisions. Great quote here from James Popham that I'll leave up on the screen just for a moment to let you kind of read for a second. And I love what Popham says here, that it's a planned process. When teachers are planning an assessment, meaning they're planning a unit of study, they're planning what they want to teach, how they're going to assess it at the end, everything in between, it's got to be planned out. And Popham would say it's better to have a poor assessment in our hands at the start of the unit than an amazing one halfway through, because I got to know where I'm going from the beginning. Then I think it's important we look at assessment elicited evidence, meaning what questions am I asking? What items am I putting in front of the students? And are they geared to give me what I'm looking for? And we're going to get into the specifics of this with some examples that we can lead and guide from. But we can have assessment items that aren't necessarily geared to what I was really looking for. And then we make a misnomer, we make a misread, we make an incorrect inference that wasn't necessarily due to the student's understanding or lack thereof. I wasn't empowered with the right question. And so we're going to dig into that and how we can lead our teachers with some specific examples and how we can continue as administrators to guide and lead this process to begin to happen more organically. And that can happen through our PLC meetings, through our grade level meetings, through our department meetings. And I want to kind of highlight this point when we think about formative assessment and formative analysis. Those aren't always the same. Sometimes when we say formative or summative assessment, we'll talk about the specifics there that sometimes get in the way. That's maybe looking at the entire score. We were looking at how many of our students met a certain bar, whether it was 80%, 60%, proficient, mastery, etc. But it's that formative analysis. And I go to a lot of sports metaphors, but I would say with rare exception, our coaches, and I want to say with that point, our performing arts teachers, so band, choir, orchestra, not just athletic coaches, they can teach us a lot. Because they don't just determine if it was right or wrong, they determine why. Why am I missing that shot? Why am I not making that tackle? Why am I not playing that note? So it's not that the student got the wrong, incorrect answer on citing textual evidence. Why was it? Was it that their comprehension was okay, but their analysis was off? Was it that they made a misconception because of the figurative language or the metaphors? And math, was it because they were struggling with the quadratic formula and they didn't know how to apply it? And so there's a balance between just the assessment itself and then what I do with the evidence to make an inference. And again, what we're going to spend time on next week and then also in December is how we lead that more effectively. What are the tools we can put in our toolboxes and how can we arm ourselves with quality questions and things that we can guide and lead teacher discussions? And what can we look for in classrooms that will help us better make the determination our teachers assessing and analyzing? Because we really need to do both. At the end of the day, the one thing we need to remember is we should assess to diagnose. It's the only reason why we should assess students. When we go to see our doctors, he or she doesn't give us a bunch of tests and then assess us. He or she usually assesses us and then determine what tests we actually need. So as we're guiding and leading teacher learning, it's the same way we're asking them to guide and lead student learning. And so this could also empower us to think about how we are making the right professional development adjustments in terms of where our teachers are and what we're providing them, not just in our whole day on-site professional development that someone like myself comes in and works with a group of teachers for several days, but in our staff meetings and our early releases, other times when we can build in some professional learning. The next aspect that I wanted to kind of highlight where we're going to kind of do some sleeve rolling up work, I want to kind of frame it around this question. I would like you to take a moment. You could write the definition down if you'd like, but define cognitive rigor. If you're with a group and you're with your administrative team and you want to pause the recording now, by all means do so. I'm not going to pause it to keep the whole recording short, but how would you define cognitive rigor? I'm going to wait and we're going to do this whole group again when we come together, but it's interesting when I do this with a large group because I often get a lot of different responses. If you look up the definition of the word rigor, you will see words like harsh, wavering, stiff, rigid. Why? It's all part of the deal. Ladies and gentlemen, we're all going to go through rigor mortis. It comes from the same Latin root as that. So when we think about that term and how we define it, it doesn't even match up with the actual definition. We're going to look at what the definition or what the concept is in our world. But here's a more important question. How do you as an instructional leader currently monitor the level accurately of the rigor that is happening in your classrooms? We all want to have rigorous instruction, rigorous assessments. How do we monitor that the rigor that's taking place in our classrooms is at the accurate level it needs to be based on where the standard is? Or that the teacher's very aware of the rigor level as the standard is, and sometimes they have to go back. Sometimes they have to go back to go forward. They have to go back and teach a remedial skill. They have to go back and go into some learning progressions. More than appropriate, we need to be able to know how we dig for that. Williamson and Blackburn, some phenomenal research that I've just synthesized here for our purposes today. First, let's talk about what are some myths about rigor. First one is it's not about more work. It's not about homework. It has nothing to do with that. It's also a myth that some kids can't do it, that they struggle, or they have for all due respect, an individual education plan, or they have a learning gap, or so they can't handle rigorous work. It's not the case. But I think the one that challenges most teachers is that if I support the student, well, it's lost it. None of us would bat an eye. I coach t-ball for my little guys, and eventually by the season's end, I want them to be able to hit a pitch ball. Some kids are ready to hit a pitch ball right off the bat. For others, I got to get down on one knee and I got to lob it really light or put it on the tee, and then I need to back up and I need to break the task down so that they can eventually get it on their own. No matter how much support I provide, it doesn't change the level of rigor of the overall task if they can eventually do it by themselves. And I think this is where more teachers struggle. Now, I would say, with all due respect, I think primary and elementary teachers struggle less. I just think it's maybe more built into their just pedagogy and just how they do business. Not being stereotypical, but for the most part, I think it's a little bit more in line there. When we think about our secondary level, sometimes we struggle, again, not being stereotypical, but sometimes we struggle a little bit because if I have to support you, I might lose my ability to know how to grade. And I'm just putting that little comment off on the shelf. But when we think about monitoring rigor, we need to know where the standard is and how we're leading the students to be able to show that they can do it. And yes, to a certain degree independently, but if I have to support you along the way, that should not get in the way of determining how rigorous it was. And so we're going to dig into Webb's depth of knowledge. And that is, when we look at Webb, some of you are familiar with it, some of you it might be new when we think about DOK, but a progression of cognitive demand that focuses on the content standards and then the thinking or the demand required to successfully complete an item or task aligned to them. So we're going to look at our standard, look at the rigor level, and then look at the task that is aligned to that. And it's important to remember, depth of knowledge is about complexity. It's the question that determines the cognitive demand, not the student work. And that's a shift for some of us. It's not that they produce more work necessarily. It's did the question cause their computer, the one between their ears, to really have to process and think, and where we have to also acknowledge we will have a level of cognitive demand that is the same for everybody, but it might be more difficult for some students, or more difficult initially. Shooting a basketball to hoop has the same level of complexity. It's more difficult for some students earlier on. So it's the cognitive demand based on the item, not the actual work. We're going to get into that with some specificity. And again, I would imagine this is review for a lot of us. But a simple way to think about it is depth of knowledge, 1, 2, 3, and 4. Levels 1 and 2, there's usually one right answer. More than a level 2, there's more than one right answer. But the difference here, depth of knowledge is not a taxonomy. We're going to take Benjamin Bloom, and he's served his time well, but we're going to kind of push Benjamin off to the side because by default, a taxonomy, which a lot of us have been raised on, it's what we've been taught, what we were using, isn't bad, but that assumes that learners are going to learn in a linear fashion. That is not always the case with DOK. Sometimes students will progress through a series of tasks and need to from 1, 2, 3, 4. Not always the case. And again, how deeply a student needs to understand the content for a given response item. So I'm kind of setting up the work that our teachers should be doing. And then what we're going to do is come in with some concrete examples and some tools and some experiences. We're going to do some of the same activities that teachers would do to be able to then lead and guide this. Now, I want to be really clear. If you've seen this recently, the circle, I want you to get rid of it. I'm going to dig us into Webb's depth of knowledge and the Hess cognitive rigor matrix. But the problem with the wheel, which was one of the first ways DOK was introduced, it's still focused on just the verb. And so I see critique and I see critique, but not get into the level of depth that we see in Hess's cognitive rigor matrix, which we're going to jump into. And just one other example why we're going to not just use taxonomy, not just use Bloom's. 3 quick examples here. Take the word or the verb describe. Describe a primary source. That's DOK 1, one right answer. Describe the differences between primary and secondary sources. That requires more cognitive processing. There are differences. There's still one right answer, but I'm going to have to justify it. We get up into level 3. How might you use a primary and secondary source to better understand a particular event in history? Now I'm required to use deep understanding of how the sources and an explanation and a how. So all I'm highlighting here is that word describe could have three very different levels of rigor, three very different levels of complexity. So another thing, as we'll kind of talk about, is that term common formative assessment. What are CFAs? And we're going to dig into the different versions of what a common formative assessment could be. But let's kind of stick with a general definition for our understanding. They're aligned pre- and post-assessments within the unit. Now, when I say aligned, that could be a mirrored pre-assessment. We're going to give the same pre and the same post at the beginning and at the end of the unit. It could be a pre-assessment that is a short, concise, like assessment that's more on the foundational skills that I need for later in the unit, and I can't always compare full pre to post, but I can see how that pre-assessment aligned with my post, my pre with my post. Collaboratively designed by multiple teachers, administered to students throughout the year, and that next bullet point is most important. They represent the assured competency and essential learning outcomes for our Visalia students. What do we say all of our students need to be able to know and be able to do by the end of third grade, fifth grade, when they get into junior high language arts, when they get into first year English in ninth grade, when they get into biology? What are those essentials? And then that's what's on our common formative assessments that we're going to give to all of our students. So it's not going to be all we teach, but we're going to agree upon what those are, and those start with our priority standards. And a lot of this work has been done with some of the grade levels. I know all might not have finished, but the criteria for a priority standard is pretty simple. Well, simple is relative, but simple formula. Does the standard have endurance? Will it stand the test of time? Now, I want to say, with rare exception, when we look at our Common Core English and Language Arts standards, a lot of them do. Although there are some that we can look at and say, yeah, even with some of the language arts ones, standard 6 in a few areas, I'm not saying they're bad. I'm just saying they might not have the level of endurance of others. In language arts, standards 1 and 2, reading for informational, reading for literary text, always. Same in math, we can see some of those. Readiness. This is where we put the teachers together. We say, okay, and I use a lot of metaphors, as you've heard already, but I would imagine that the football teams have a varsity level that the coach demands that they will use the same blocking, cadence, and all those kind of schemes, understood with the same terminology for varsity, JV, and freshman. Why? Because it's their program. They should. Here's what you should be doing by the end of your freshman year, and here's how we're going to call it. Same thing in language arts. What are the things students need to know and be able to do to be successful from 8 to 9, 9 to 10, 10 to 11? What do they need to do successful in math or language arts from 2nd to 3rd to 4th? Those are those readiness skills. Leverage skills, those are going to be the things that are going to pass multiple disciplines. For example, when we see the word argument, that's a great word that they've added into the Common Core standards. And again, this isn't a Common Core session by any means, but certainly we're using those standards in California. But think about it. Students will make an argument, write an argumentative essay in social studies as to what was the main cause of the War of 1812. They will argue in their literature essay as to why a certain event really impacted Jim's perception of Atticus in To Kill a Mockingbird. They will argue why a titration lab wasn't as successful as they thought based on one of the variables. Kids argue all the time. So now I've come up with a standard that might have, or an example that might have some leverage across disciplines. The fourth would be our external exams. And since California is a Smarter Balance state, what we're saying there is, are we using the format of Smarter Balance to possibly guide? If there's anything we can see that's going to be assessed more there, we would look at that as a consideration, only after the other three have been thought of. Now, you have a short handout that kind of highlights the 10-step Common Formative Assessment framework from Larry Ainsworth, and I'm not going to read them all to you. You've got the blurb. Some of your teachers are going through this work now, some may be more down the road. But when you look at these 10 steps, we can really realize they are just simple bread and butter practices. It's the framework Larry put together after his first version, and what you see in blue is the writing of the assessment, identifying the priority standards, unwrapping them for the rigor level, determining the big ideas and essential questions, creating the post-assessment, scoring guides, and the pre-assessment. But then he's added those other parts that are in red that we bring into the process that don't have to necessarily come in before those happen. But really, early on, we should start thinking, what are the learning intentions and success criteria? How do we evaluate some of our items for revision and quality? And then those last 2 points. When we're thinking about this unit that I'm teaching, have I thought about the learning progressions? What are some things kids will have to go through as a sequence of learning to meet some of my instructional needs, and how will I check for those? And this is where we might need to go back to go forward. Before students can cite textual evidence, they have to understand some reading comprehension. They have to be able to determine what is relevant or irrelevant textual evidence. So use that as an example. So all 10 of these steps are really, as I've mentioned, just good bread and butter practices. Now, some of the teachers currently are going through some specific professional development work around this, but I'm going to guide us as leaders where we can build in some of those first couple steps, the priority standards and the unwrapping, that will help them better determine, are the assessment questions that we're using aligned to what the standards say? And you're going to kind of see that it's going to make more sense when we get together, but this is just kind of an overview. And again, part of why I mentioned to Phil and with some of the other leaders in the district why I was looking forward to having this happen is when we look at the Wallace Foundation. They did an amazing study about 7 years ago, and they looked at all of the factors, about 1,200 schools were involved, of what was really leading towards high achievement and high learning in schools. And they talked about instructional climate, an instructional climate where we value research-based strategies that they're able to apply in their own school setting. And what they found, number one, out of anything that they looked at in their studies, effective classroom instruction was number one. Second, and a very close second, was leadership, specifically by the principal. Now, in the larger schools, they defined principal as assistant principal too. So for those of you who are in an AP role, size of your schools, you probably were included in that. But I love that quote. It was a summary quote that was at the bottom of their first section. They had not found one single case of a school improving its achievement in the absence of talented leadership. So those of us that are in these roles, we're critical because what do? We help guide and lead the effective instruction, which was number one. So why we are coming together is how can we get better? And so I want to be really clear. Dave isn't assuming anything is off or wrong, but how can I help guide that we get even better at the most important thing that happens? And that's the classroom instruction is truly aligned to where the kids are. And that might mean we have to, at times, better assess, more effectively diagnose our students to a certain degree. Last thing I want to kind of highlight and mention is where some of the foundation for what we're going to be guiding through is Professor John Hattie's work. Most of us are familiar with visible learning. I'm very fortunate I'm one of the visible learning certified presenters. But what John Hattie has done is taken now over 1,100 meta-analyses. Those are studies upon studies upon studies, over a 250 students. And he has synthesized them, used something called an effect size measure. That would mean if the study was done in California, right now we would use Smarter Balance. We might have used the CSAT before. If it was done in Indiana, you'd use the ISTEP. It was done in Germany, you'd use the Arbiter. It didn't matter where the assessment tool was used for the dissertation. Hattie found the average effect of achievement over time is 0.4. What that means in this, we're measuring growth. We can't measure from 0. It's 0.4. So Hattie has found out of his 230 now influences, there are some things that actually make learning go backwards. Things that have maybe developmental effects. Anything between 0.2 and 0.3 would be typical teacher effects. And we're going to talk a little bit more about this next week. If this is not familiar with you, please do not panic at all. This is just an overview of Hattie's research that I think makes enough sense for now. But what Hattie would say, out of all of his studies, the average effect is 0.4. So it would tell us anything below 0.4 is less than average. So let's look at a couple that actually apply to some of the things we're going to be asking us to think about when we come together next week. First one is leading teacher learning. This is how Hattie broke down all of his studies and found the biggest influence on student learning, not a surprise, comes from the student. They're in charge. In a school, though, not that the principals aren't important, or the school or the peer or the home, they certainly matter. Nothing compared in the school to the teacher. So the more we develop our teachers around the good, solid practices, the more they're going to best be in place to pull the really good stuff out of the students and maybe minimize some of the challenges. So the first thing is we are talking about developing our teachers over time with quality assessment tools, practices, and assessment literacy. Not just giving them quality tests to use, but develop the literacy to know how to utilize any results they're getting. But I wanted to dive into two of Hattie's influences. First one, that ranked all the way up at number 5, providing formative evaluation. Not just formative assessment, but formative assessment certainly falls in there. Anytime as a teacher I'm providing a formative assessment for my students, I'm eliciting questions in my discussion group, I'm getting feedback from my administrator, all those things I use more than double the average, 0.9. Again, 0.4 is the average. Formative evaluation, 0.9. We're going to dig into what that looks like. The other one that I wanted to mention was effective professional development, and it comes in at 0.62. And I always say, as a professional developer, hopefully a little bit of job security, because at least it's above average. Now, I want to highlight for any of Hattie's studies, when we see 0.9 or 0.62, that's the average. The average of all the studies is 0.62, which means there were some even higher, obviously some lower. But these are the things that are in the evidence, and the evidence, I think, of common sense, of what really drives effective professional development. The first one is it's got to challenge existing beliefs. I am probably going to challenge some of us next week in terms of is what we're doing giving us the best result, and are what our teachers doing really aligned to what evidence tells us. The next one has to do with how we take what teachers are learning in their classroom and apply it with their peers. Are they talking to their peers about teaching? Is the structure set up not just to have a PLC meeting, but to make sure the culture's there so that way we're truly sharing the right kinds of evidence? Then the last one, which is John Hattie's new number one, called collective teacher efficacy. And I wanted to just highlight, as we're going to go through these days, and I know this was big, broad brushstroke for us, D equals 1.57. So that's basically saying the effect of collective teacher efficacy is coming in at 4 times 1 year's growth. First off, we have to have our own efficacy. But then when we think about collective teacher efficacy, the beliefs teachers as a group have to promote the successful outcomes in their students. So that's why when we talk about building a common formative assessment, that we all agree upon the format, we all agree upon the administration, it can really lend into these things. Because these things are really what drive collective teacher efficacy. First one is teachers have to apply new knowledge. They need to have a chance as they learn how to unwrap standards and dig into the DOK and dig into the standards, how to apply that on an ongoing basis. There must be some degree of positive interdependence, where teachers are accountable to each other. And finally, look at the assessment results. Are we having fine-grained discourse around learning? We're not just looking at the score total, we're looking at what did these 5 items tell me about what the students knew or might not have known. And the more we can have them come up with a common challenge, here's our focus, here's our 2 or 3 priority standards for the unit, we have a better chance to make that happen. And so, as a reminder for those of us that are going to be thinking next week, some of you are going to have teachers that are going through, my fingers, 4 days with myself or 4 days with a gentleman named Tremaine. Some staff, we're not going to be at that level, but I'm going to provide some tools that we can build right into our staff meetings. How to unwrap. I'm going to be providing several webinars that you could take back and record, or take back to the record and show your staff and use them. This was one that I didn't make very interactive, but a lot of times what I do is I'll, record them, and then it's just like a little mini seminar for 15 minutes where they walk through some information, they have a handout, and they stop. So to be really clear, there's going to be a lot of extra tools that you're going to walk away with. But teachers cannot just apply new knowledge. If they only hear it and they don't get a chance to acquire it, if they don't get a chance to apply it, very little changes. And I want to go back to the Joyce and Showers research of the 80s, which has already been replicated 2 other times. They learn the theory. They see it demonstrated. They actually have a chance to practice it. They actually have a chance to receive corrective feedback. It's not until there's job-embedded coaching where there's a serious shift in the percentage of teachers implementing the new practice. And even in the 80s, Joyce and Showers defined job-embedded coaching very, very loosely. They specifically said it doesn't mean we need to have a specific assigned coach. It just needs to be ongoing. It's what's happening in our PLC meetings. It's what's happening in our staff meetings. It's what's happening in our early release or our PLC meetings. It's what's happening when you go back to the room. My walkthroughs, my observations are around coaching the process. So what I'm highlighting with some broad brushstrokes, and we'll get into the very specifics of this next week, where we might be headed going in, and where are you right now in terms of, as a leader, leading and guiding not only formative assessment work, but anything we're doing to make sure what we do really, really, really well. What you will walk away with, to wrap up, and I think it's a fair question, what's in it for me? What are you going to get? You're going to be giving at least one day next week and then one in December away from your building, but a deeper understanding of foundational assessment practices that you can model and monitor and use to guide and adjust your classroom walkthroughs, your discussions with teachers. I'm going to be providing some specific tools you can use to apply coaching and leading and monitoring What's the impact of the improved formative assessment practices in your school on learning outcomes? And might this be where we look at some of our current assessment data, maybe what's come back from Smarter Balance, and say we should be maybe making more of an emphasis on, I don't know, more in math or more in language arts or more in writing because of the results we've seen. I'm hoping that we can walk out with a completed action plan. I want to just preface this why I put an asterisk there. It might not be complete by the end of the day. I'm going to try and get as many opportunities for us to fill that in, but it's certainly going to be a good start for how you determine assessment evidence, how you monitor that. What does that look like? And what does that look like that we know can't happen in a walkthrough? Kim Marshall says we need to abandon walkthroughs. What he means is it's not that we abandon short mini observations, but we call them short mini observations. Excuse me, I'm sorry. We don't walk through a classroom. What he would say is walk through a classroom for 2 minutes or you're staying at least 10. Meaning if I'm walking through for 2 minutes, I'm not recording anything. I'm walking in, I'm saying hi, I'm patting a kiddo on the head, I'm just making an appearance. Everybody says, hey, the principal was here today. Everybody knows, especially the teacher, there wasn't any evidence being gathered. If I'm going to stay more than that, I'm going to stay for 10 minutes because I'm going to make sure I see something that I could give a quality question to. And I might need to stay a while and see how you move from the opening to the transition to the reading group. Or I might need to see how you formulated your discussion. Point is we're going to give ourselves permission to stay longer and really gather a better inference. And then finally, I've already created a couple tools that I've shared with the group, but developed some predetermined look-fors. What are some things you could look for in classrooms, but also in some of the assessment students or teachers are using, and also in some of your conversations that you're going to be having with teachers in your observation, pre and post meetings, things of that nature. So you're going to walk out with it with a very nice set of tools that I think you're going to find very useful. I'm hoping this was empowering, and I want to just finish with, if you have a thought or a question, please shoot me an email, or you have my cell phone number. If you're on Twitter, I'd welcome the follow and would love to engage with you there sometime. But I am looking forward to seeing everybody next Tuesday. I'm going to see some of your teachers next Monday who were in the first cohorts last summer. But again, I'm really looking forward to seeing everybody next week. If you have any questions, please let me know. Very excited to come back and see my good friends in Visalia. Have a great rest of your week. We'll see you next Tuesday.